So good afternoon from Brussels, or good morning for those watching in the US. My name is Thibault Lortie. I'm the Director of Public Affairs at AmCham EU. On behalf of the three host organizations today, AmCham EU, BusinessEurope, and the US Chamber of Commerce, I'm delighted to welcome you for this conversation, gearing up for the EU-US Summit Transatlantic Business Perspectives. So I'm sitting here in Brussels, and I can tell you there is some kind of buzz in the city with the arrival of President Biden. He's here for the NATO summit today and for tomorrow, the EU-US summit, the first one in 7 years, and that's going to be the topic of today's conversation. We've got a great set of speakers today to talk about expectations from the transatlantic business community ahead of the EU-US summit. And so joining us today, Marjorie Chorlins, Senior Vice President for European Affairs at the US Chamber of Commerce. The US Chamber represents companies of all sizes and sectors in the US. Susan Denger, CEO of AmCham EU. AmCham EU speaks for American companies committed to and invested in Europe. And Luisa Santos, Deputy Director General of BusinessEurope. BusinessEurope is the leading business organizations speaking on behalf of companies of all sizes in over 35 European countries. So it was very important for all three organizations to be together today to show the commitment of the transatlantic business community to an ambitious EU-US agenda. To moderate today's conversation, I'm delighted to welcome Benjamin Haddad, Director of the Europe Center at the Atlantic Council. Ben is a leading expert on the transatlantic economy and keen observer of American and European politics. Please do feel free to contribute to this conversation using the chat function. The event is public and on the record. And with that, Ben, I'll hand over to you to kick off today's conversation. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Thibault. Good morning to those watching in the United States. Good afternoon in Europe. I'm Ben Haddad. I'm the Director of the Europe Center at the Atlantic Council here in Washington, D.C. And I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to moderate this great panel. Obviously, very timely as we are in the midst of President Biden's first international trip, a trip to Europe, an important signal of U.S. engagement with its key allies. We just wrapped up the G7 summit yesterday in the UK. We're going to talk a little bit about it. We had an ambitious communique that talked about climate, health, China, resilience. But of course, we're mostly going to focus on the upcoming US-EU summit in Brussels. And I would say more importantly, on how can we reset a strong transatlantic relationship with business and economics at its core. The United States and Europe are first trade partners, and this business and trade and innovation relationship is obviously key to the agenda of the summit. I'm joined by Marjorie Chorlins, Susan Denger, and Luisa Santos to discuss this. As Thibault said, please don't hesitate to ask questions in the chat, and I'll pick them up for the second part of the conversation. Let me start maybe just with a first ambiance question. Thibault talked about buzz in the city. From what I read on social media, there's also a lot of traffic in the city because of the president's visit. But I'd love to hear from all three of you. We're in the midst of this visit. How do you feel first about the G7 and some of the conclusions, and I would say the general atmosphere? And what's your sense of where this relationship is as the president is headed to Brussels? Let's maybe start with stay in Washington, D.C., and I start with Marjorie Chorlins from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce.
Thanks, Ben. It's great to be with you, and always a pleasure to share the virtual stage with my good friends, making us the three amigas, I think, Luisa, Susan, and me. So happy to be here. Look, on the G7 summit, I would say good outcomes, not as robust as we might have hoped in some areas, but not surprising, given the differences on some critical issues among the players. In terms of the Transatlantic Summit, I would say the mood is very upbeat. It's obvious that we're in a different place right now between the US and Europe than we were even, a year ago, less than a year ago. But there's also a sense of realism, right? There are limited expectations about what we anticipate to come out of the summit. So I think there's a sense of relief on the one hand, a bit of hope on the other hand, and also some realism about what we can achieve.
Realism about what we can achieve. Susan Danger, is that also your sense?
Yeah, no, thanks, and great to be with everybody today. I mean, maybe just realism. I think yeah, absolutely. I'd agree with Marjorie there. I think, first of all, the mood is good, actually. I would even add the word excitement, possibly, Marjorie, to that. Although also a bit of making sure you get to the office early in Brussels, Ben, so you get in before they do close the roads today. So there's going to be a fair amount of disruption. But apart from that, I think generally a sense of relief also. So just firstly on the G7, yeah, a sense of relief. Great to see the sort of everyone getting on well. At least that's what we saw on the beaches in Cornwall. And as a Brit, I thought it was very encouraging. I think we're certainly feeling that there is a sort of partnership is being reestablished. And I think that's a positive mood. Saying that to the realism piece, indeed, I think the mood is one of, yes, positive momentum is there, but this is not necessarily going back to what everyone keeps saying is the normal before. We're not going back to the days before. That doesn't mean to say that's a bad thing. It's just going to be different. So it's a realistic view going forward. Perhaps I think maybe for the ambiance here as well in Brussels, but let's remember there's Brussels bubble and there's Brussels, just as a sense of realism. I discreetly bounced it off a couple of friends at the weekend. Let's face it, if you're not in the Brussels bubble, you're possibly not even aware that there's a big visit. I'm just saying that. I think we need to be realistic on that. It's not at the top of everyone's agenda, and I think we need to be aware of citizens. I think that's a thing. I'm sure we'll come to that later. Where do citizens come into all of that? But on the whole, yeah, good feeling here at the moment, Ben.
All right, realism, but relief and positive momentum. Yes. Louisa, let me turn to you for the same question.
Thanks, Ben, and good afternoon to everyone. Well, I share both Marjorie and Susan's assessment. I think the G7 was very important this year. I mean, if we see the pictures of this year G7 and the last G7 pictures, you see the difference. It's starking difference. So I think even the posture of the leaders has changed significantly. And also the communique, it might not be ambitious in many areas, but it is a substantial improvement as compared to the last time. And I also think for the US, it was very important because it basically rallied the West when it comes to China. Maybe not going as far as the US would like to go, but definitely showing that in what concerns China and some of the challenges that China poses to the Western standards, the Western views, it did get us some momentum, and this new initiative of Build Back Better to the World is something that is positive coming out of the summit. We need to see how it's going to be implemented in practice, but this is a US initiative that actually gathered a lot of support also from G7 allies. So I think this is very good, and it is a good opening start for the EU-US summit. And by the way, we also have the EU-Canada summit. So it is kind of a transatlantic and positive week. And I'm sure we will discuss a bit more in detail what we can expect from this EU-US summit.
Yeah, so that's a perfect segue because we can do that now. But you're right. I mean, I think it is important to say that the positive images do matter. They do create positive momentum. We shouldn't, we should get more than that. And now we need to look at the concrete steps. But it is important that it's a change from the previous years. And I expect, of course, to have more positive images coming out of the NATO summit, which is going to be really core to the president's message and reaffirming his support for collective defense, and of course the US-EU summit. But then turning to the summit with the EU beyond the positive pictures, what can we expect? We'll talk about the long-term agenda, but I even want just to focus on the summit itself. I mean, what can we expect concretely? Can we address some of the irritants, some of the are there any low-hanging fruits that we could get from that summit? Let me first maybe turn to you, Susan, about this.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Ben. And I think, yes, let's address the irritants, and perhaps picking up just on what Louisa said there, I think we should state it, we have had 4 years of whatever you call it, tumult and uncertainty. I think people are bolder about that and just stating it up front now, including those in the US government, that this is definitely the chance to sort of reinvigorate and recast. So that's now what we want. It's not only the bit of the mood music, but it's definitely what we want from the business community side. So yeah, maybe the first step, certainly from the American business point of view here, and I imagine my colleagues here will probably agree, is get rid of the irritants. It seems to some as quite an easy step. We'd like to think it should be easy. I'm not sure how easy it's going to be, but if we take aircraft subsidies as one, the Airbus-Boeing dispute, how many years has this been going on for? We just need to push that aside and we need to move on. It takes away a lot of energy and it has impact on other industries that is just not helpful. We need to put this aside. The other one is what's called the Section 232. So basically what's otherwise known as steel and aluminium tariffs. This is out there. It's not helping in terms of even, just that, I want to refer to this sort of the relationship between the EU and the US in terms of trust. The EU doesn't feel great being thought of as a threat to security. So I know we all know it goes deeper than that, but we do need to move that on. However, I know there are challenges with regard to the domestic political agenda over in the US, which I'm sure Marjorie could address. And then the third irritant would be the privacy shield. We've got to have a sustainable system to transfer data across the Atlantic. It's absolutely fundamental. And we're not just talking about tech industry here, we're talking about all industries. So that's the first one, Ben. I don't know if you want me to just continue a bit there with now, if you say that's sort of maybe a bit more negative, let's put that aside because we want the positive agenda is there. The ambiance is good. So now on the sort of positive front, I would outline 3 areas, maybe less low hanging. It's a matter of, it's going to be a bit subjective on whether this is low hanging or not. Let's take 3 areas. I think the first one fundamentally is we have to support economic recovery, whether it's Europe, whether it's the US, whether it's global. So actually, we'd welcome the bold policy response also in the G7. There was, and we've still got to, the details have got to be fleshed out about everyone agreeing this is absolutely vital. So we've got to work closely together, absolutely support more international cooperation in economic recovery. That's global economic recovery. I think the other aspect about economic recovery we would push for is travel restrictions. And whether they're travel restrictions here in Europe, we're starting to see that free up, but also across the Atlantic, we've got to be able to travel in a safe way. That's absolutely key. Another one, so secondly, I would say reducing barriers to trade generally. So for that, we need to deepen regulatory cooperation. We've had some great results in some sectors, pharma, medical devices, but we could still move further on that. So this is, again, really, really positive. This is a positive step. Clinical research, for example, it's global, differences in standards. If we could just establish mutual recognition agreement on that, it would really help. Reform of the WTO is another one there, reducing barriers to trade. And then finally, just the third point of expectations from the summit, from the business point of view here, what I would say, outline a roadmap now to address the emerging issues. So we've got the issues that exist as the low hanging, and now we move on to the emerging issues. It's clear on both sides, an emphasis on the green future and a digital future. That's not going away. So let's focus on emerging issues, the climate emergency. I'm sure we'll come to that again later. Digital transformation, absolutely fundamental. And we need transatlantic leadership on this. We also need transatlantic leadership generally. I know this came out from the G7 on projecting common values, these democratic values that they focused on at the weekend. Absolutely, totally agree with that. Overall, we need global standards. So there's some very positive areas of movement, I would say, Ben. So those are my thoughts for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Very ambitious agenda, clearly on the irritants, Airbus, Boeing, Section 232, and privacy shield. And I think really all 3 need to be urgently addressed. And then a lot on economic recovery, travel restrictions as a European on the other side of the Atlantic, I can only acquiesce, and green future and digital future. I want to turn to Marjorie with the same question, and would love to hear a little more about the digital agenda. I think that's really going to be key at the summit. We've seen the EU develop an ambitious normative agenda with its sort of digital sovereignty mission in the last few years. It's been one of the pillars of the new European Commission. Want to hear also your thoughts on what are the areas of cooperation between the United States and the European Union shaping common norms on tech and digital?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Ben. Look, for starters, I agree obviously with everything that Susan just laid out in terms of the near-term irritants that need to be resolved. And from a digital perspective, obviously getting Privacy Shield done and dusted is extraordinarily important. As she said, this is not just a tech issue. This is an every company, every sector issue. And frankly, in the absence of an agreement here, we're beginning to see various data protection authorities around Europe moving in exactly the opposite direction. We're starting to see restrictions appear for a number, or at a minimum, tremendous uncertainty, but in other instances, actual restrictions on companies' ability to share data in a fulsome way. So, so that's a real issue, and one where I'd like to think we'll see more momentum come out of the summit. Not expecting a deal, but at least more momentum. Look, on the issue of Europe's tech sovereignty and the prospects for a positive agenda, there's no question that the von der Leyen Commission has put the digital transition as one of its top 2 priorities, along with the green transition. And in the context of that digital transition, Europe talks about technological sovereignty. From our perspective, the idea of Europe wanting to improve its competitiveness is A, absolutely understandable, and B, quite desirable, in fact. The question is, how do they go about doing that? And to the extent that Europe is considering policies that would effectively discriminate against a small number of American companies, that's where we see the rub. Are there opportunities for us to coordinate and collaborate? Absolutely, 100%, especially when it comes to setting standards for emerging technologies, especially when it comes to issues like fighting back against cyber threats and so on. So definitely a positive agenda. I think the question is whether what's in the pipeline for Europe runs the risk of undermining that positive agenda. We see that in terms of the proposed Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, the AI principles, and the broader data strategy. Again, all of these measures on themselves, not per se an issue, but the question is how they go about doing what they seek to achieve. Same with digital services taxes, unilateral measures that discriminate against a handful of American companies, obviously problematic from our perspective. Understand the impulse, but practically speaking, there's a real issue. I think of all of the issues that are on the agenda right now, I would say the DMA is probably the most troublesome as it's currently drafted. Again, in terms of targeting a handful of US companies, frankly, for having been successful, and wanting to impose a series of rules and restrictions on them that really don't jive with what is traditional regulation in this area. So real concerns about tech sovereignty morphing into digital protectionism. And that's one of the reasons why we've been pushing the administration to be prepared to not only collaborate with Europe where the opportunities exist, but also to push back against bad policies. Now, one idea that's emerged from the Commission that we think is actually a terrific idea is the so-called US-EU Trade and Technology Council, a sort of strategic dialogue or formal platform that allows the two sides to talk not only about existing barriers and prevent new barriers, but also to set those standards for emerging technologies in particular. This is also a platform where I think the US and Europe could work together to respond to some of China's unfair practices when it comes to the tech space. And so from our perspective, I'd like to see the summit launch this kind of a council It's got a lot of work ahead of it. It's not intended to be TTIP, but it does reflect an opportunity to really get at some of the key issues that will drive competitiveness for both the US and Europe going forward.
Thank you. I want to turn to Luisa for the same question on what to expect for the summit, but then I'd love to do another round specifically on the Trade and Tech Council. I think it might be one of the big announcements coming out of the summit. It's been an issue that's been much discussed on both sides of the Atlantic, but it's still a little fuzzy over what it would concretely look like, how it would be organized, who would be part of it. So I'd love also to hear from all three of you what you expect from it concretely, and what role can European and American businesses play as well, beyond just the regular sort of government to government dimension of it. But let me turn first to Luisa Santos for the same question on expectations from the summit. And you can address the Trade and Tech Council, of course.
Thanks, Ben. Well, I think I agree with Susan and Marjorie overall on the main expectations and the main outcomes of this summit. I think there are also other areas where we definitely need to talk, and let's see what comes out of this summit. I mean, one of them is climate change. We have this year also an important benchmark, and that's COP26. This is definitely one area where this new US administration is changing completely what was the pattern of the previous administration. So we see more engagement in this area. It's an important aspect of also the G7 communique that for the first time we have a recognition of a potential issue of carbon leakage. This means that if a lot of countries take more ambitious commitments, but others don't, there is clearly a risk that some of the investment or some of the more polluting industries will go to these third countries. And then in the end, you do not achieve your objective, which is to fight climate change and to increase climate ambition. So I think here it's important to see what the EU and the US can do more together ahead of COP26. And how can we also work together to increase ambition globally? I think this is definitely one area that is very important, apart from all the areas that both Susan and Marjorie highlighted. I think on WTO reform, I was very happy to see a strong commitment to multilateralism, to rules-based international trade, free and fair trade coming out of G7. I think we really need, in the run out also to MC12, we really need cooperation and leadership from the US, the EU, and like-minded countries. This will be very critical because this year is also very important to restate the trust and the effectiveness of the WTO. This is very important. So I think here it's also good, or I hope we can see a good roadmap of cooperation between the EU and US. Specifically on the technology and Trade and Technology Council, I think we are, and I agree with Marjorie, the business has an important role to play. We are trying to see what could be the scope of this council, what topics. We don't see only digital per se. Of course, there's a lot on digital, a lot on cybersecurity, a lot on standardization. We see also a bit the upstream, issues like critical minerals, export controls, even FDI screening. I mean, we see also this a potential area of interest if we want really to have an overall strategy when it comes to trade and technology. So I see this more as a evolving agenda that we are a starting point, but definitely I think it's very important to have a strong involvement of the business community on the two sides of the Atlantic to make sure that the agenda fits the reality and the needs of the market. That I think is also very important.
Thank you. I want to stay just on that Tech and Trade Council question, turn to Susan and then Marjorie.
I mean, I'm not sure I've got so much to add now, Ben, on trade and tech. I'd agree with Marjorie and Luisa there that we support it. I think actually maybe one aspect to when we get more to green is also the Green Tech Allowance that's on the, Green Tech Alliance that is on the table. And I think, if we don't want to sort of introduce some sort of new major dialogue. But if we're honest, and this has been brought up in Europe at this time, there is no sort of formal structure for dialogue between the EU and the US anymore. There are between other countries, between Canada and the US, between Japan and the US. There is nothing between the US and Europe. So actually the Trade and Tech Council, we'd certainly see this as a very concrete step towards addressing a whole range of issues. As Louisa said, it's not just about tech, it just encompasses everything. So very supportive, and indeed very important to have business at the table as a stakeholder being part of those discussions. Absolutely.
And I think it is one key question. There's actually no formal dialogue between the United States and the European Union. This possible tech and trade dialogue. There's also the possibility of a sort of strategic defense and security dialogue, including NATO as well. That's something that's a little bit missing from the relationship today.
Indeed, yeah, I was just to say, yeah, I think there's only the one that came up here the other day. There's, we got the financial services dialogue, but apart from that, there's not a lot going on. So I think we definitely encourage it. And going back to what I mentioned earlier about emerging issues, definitely let's put AI on there. Artificial intelligence is an obvious one to get there, where we sort of on values, we're probably already very closely aligned, as we are on many issues. So let's get in there on some of these emerging issues quickly.
Mm-hmm. Marjorie.
Yeah, look, I think it is the case that the agenda for the Trade and Technology Council needs to be broader than just a conversation about current tech issues and emerging tech issues, although it is a Trade and Technology Council, so this is obviously going to feature prominently. The Chamber has put out a paper outlining some principles and a few structural recommendations, as well as a preliminary list of topics for the Council. Obviously, again, heavy emphasis on tech, but also listing climate and climate from the standpoint of technological innovation, as well as some critical trade issues that obviously will impact the agenda. It's interesting, in the run-up to the summit, it had been our understanding that the administration had undertaken something of an inventory of current US-EU dialogues or platforms, or fill in the blank, however you want to describe it. And it was described to me as there being a number of vestigial conversations or platforms that have been out there for a long time, but have been largely dormant. So I think the effort here is to try to give some structure to that conversation, recognizing at the same time that Undersecretary of State Wendy Sherman was just in Europe talking with the EU about the China dialogue. And indeed, there may also be this conversation about security. So I don't think everything is going to be put into the basket of the Trade and Technology Council, but I do think having a platform where we can talk about emerging technologies and how to effectively regulate them, how to minimize discrimination between our markets, how to ensure that we're able to push back against each other's policies when we think they're headed in the wrong direction, and how to deal with some of the very real concerns about things like cloud market access or platform regulation or things like that, where it's not in our interest, frankly, to become digital islands, but rather to work together to set the rules of the road for the global economy.
Mm-hmm. I have a question. By the way, continue to ask questions on the Q&A chat. I'll pick them up in a few minutes. I see one that's very relevant to this current conversation, so maybe I'll just read it out loud now, and then any of you can address it. Just to continue on the Tech and Trade Council conversation, Valentina Papp from the FT is asking, would you expect concrete coordination between the EU and the US positions going into international standards organizations? And on regulation, would this Tech Council have prevented DMA, for instance? I don't know, Marjorie, if you want to pick up on that, or Louisa or Susan.
Look, would the existence of a bilateral strategic dialogue have was it prevented the DMA? I think the answer is not necessarily. I think where there is the possibility where I think the proposed council holds hope is in the ability to, as the two sides are developing their policies in this space, to have candid conversations about their own experiences, what's worked, what hasn't worked, what would be consistent with international norms and so on, commitments that both sides have made to international trade rules and so on. So would it have prevented the DMA? I'm not sure. Would it possibly have had an impact on the scope and breadth and sort of underlying premise of the DMA? It's entirely possible. There's no question, as I said at the outset, that Europe is headed down a road that it believes will put it in a position for greater tech sovereignty, and it will adopt policies accordingly. From our perspective, again, that's not a bad thing on itself. The question is whether a conversation like this can ensure that, as a starting premise, the direction is not fundamentally discriminatory from the outset. In terms of going in jointly in terms of international standards organizations, I think it's really, that's really an open question. The issue is more as regards emerging technologies, whether we can between us agree on what makes sense in terms of standards, and then go off and sell those, whether in the context of international standards bodies or in using other platforms.
When we talk about international standards, there's of course one other country that looms large, the question of China. Luisa, you mentioned it a little earlier, especially talking about the G7 communique, where there was a big China agenda, some cooperation on climate, but mostly competition. And it's of course one of the contexts for this conversation for transatlantic tech alliance and convergence. I want to ask you, Luisa, and then Susan and Marjorie, what you expect coming out of the summit when it comes to China and US-EU cooperation on China. And I'd be interested to hear the perspective, of course, of businesses that are involved probably in trade with China as well. How you view the growing competitive environment between the United States and China.
Well, that's a very relevant question, and I think this has been very much at the center of a lot of the discussions and a lot of measures that the US administration has been taking in the last years. They concern the rivalry that exists between the US and China. It's a rivalry that is not just economic, it's technological, it's also military in a way. And I mean, Europe for the moment has been, or until very recently, a bit looking at what was happening. Of course, we are already suffering the impact, we as European business, with a lot of the measures that the US has taken that have a strong impact on global value chains, and European companies are involved in these value chains and are highly exposed to China and the Chinese market. I think the main issue going forward is how much are we going to cooperate on China? Because until now, the US has taken these decisions alone, unilaterally, without seeking cooperation and discussion with other countries, with like-minded partners like the EU or others. So what we expect now going for the future is that we see a different approach, that we discuss these topics, because in the end, a lot of them concern us both. I mean, when we're talking about market distortions, when we are talking about the excessive role of state-owned enterprises in the Chinese economy, when we are talking about industrial subsidies, when we are talking about forced technology transfers, this impacts as much US companies as European companies. So we should try to find common ground to address them together. We still think the WTO is an important venue for this. I mean, we have been discussing still during the previous US administration together with Japan on rules for industrial subsidies. I mean, the work has not been completed yet. We know that the European Commission in the meantime has presented a proposal on competitive neutrality. I think it would be good that together, us, the US, Japan, Canada, Australia, we try to find a common ground in this area of rules that address this idea of competitive neutrality, because this is creating a lot of market distortions around the world, and including also in European market and the US market. So it needs a broad and global cooperation, and we need to try to address it through the rules. And I think one of us alone will not make it. I mean, China is very big. It has a lot of tools. It is a very important partner worldwide. So I think we need to come up with more of a common approach. And this new project that came out of G7 on Build Back Better World, it's something we need to build on also in other areas and try to have more of a common approach.
Susan, can I ask you the same question?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I mean, with respect to China, I mean, we're sort of in the middle here, being the US business based in Europe. So it's not our place certainly to reach out and tell the EU what to do. But what we do believe is that China needs to be at the table too. We need to engage with them. I mean, China can't be ignored. Indeed, Louisa mentioned, you know, for quite a number of years now, the US government has been trying to encourage Europe and business here to speak out and sort of to engage and discuss a joint approach. I think now the good news is at the G7, that's been done. We are discussing it, as was mentioned. It wasn't China wasn't even mentioned in the last G7 communique, so that's a positive sign. So China can't be ignored, but we do feel, you know, it's a very important market for business, investment market. So we can't just leave it standing by. So we would say cooperation. It all comes down at the end of the day to cooperation, whether it's international cooperation, whether it's, again, European business and US business cooperating, talking together. But again, we do need to get a commitment to free and fair trade, get rid of the market distortive practices that Louisa mentioned. And basically, if we can, support China's integration into the global economy. That should be the ultimate aim. So with that, you know, we've a long way to go, but I think we've made some progress.
And Marjorie, would like to turn the same question to you.
Sure. Look, as regards China, there's no doubt that here in the US, there has been a notable hardening of attitudes over the last couple of years. You've just seen passage of legislation, that bipartisan passage of legislation, what a rare and wonderful thing nowadays, specifically with an eye towards China and the unfair competition that it represents. I don't necessarily view the state of play as a rivalry between the US and China. I view the state of play as China representing a threat, both the international rules of the global economy and also to our norms as democratic societies. We've seen an evolution, obviously, in Europe's thinking towards China, now having sort of I would argue, a more balanced view of China as a partner, as a competitor, and as a systemic rival and strategic competitor. And I think that more holistic view is extremely important in terms of being willing to develop the tools and the approaches needed to really push back on China's unfair practices at home and coercive actions abroad. Europe is still, I think, of mixed views about China and how hard to be forward-leaning. That's understandable because different member states have different profiles with respect to China. Practically speaking, though, I think there is a growing awareness that we are better off when we work together where we can to align our practices, for example, around things like investment screening or export controls, to push back against China's unfair practices. Can we come together and achieve this sort of unified front, if you will, on all facets of the relationship? No, I don't think so. But are there ways that we can work with Europe and indeed with other allies to push back against China's unfair practices? I think the answer is yes. Some of that definitely does need to happen for example, in the WTO. building on the work of that trilateral on subsidies. But I do also think that it is in our shared interest, it's in the interest of the business community on both sides, for the US and EU to take as forward-leaning an approach as possible, recognizing, of course, that we're not talking about total decoupling. On the contrary, that would be, I think that would be devastating. Let's put it this way, it wouldn't reflect the realities of today's global economy to do that. And I don't think that's certainly not what we're calling for. But what we are calling for is a more robust, shared approach to push back against the challenges.
Yeah, more robust shared approach. And I think we are slowly getting there. I mean, it's interesting to see also just in Europe, the change of mood in last year, the European Parliament sort of burying the investment agreement after China sanctioned European officials. So there is, I think, a lot of room for convergence. And I think Susan mentioned the fact that there's a lot of difference between this G7 communique and the previous G7 communique, where we can even agree on China language. One other issue, though, on which I think there is a lot of convergence, a lot of room for cooperation, is of course the green transition. It's been one of the priorities of the the European Commission, the von der Leyen Commission, one of the two big priorities with the digital transition, but also, of course, of the Biden administration. One of the first decision was very symbolic and very important in the transatlantic space was the reintegration of the Paris climate change agreement, and then the gathering of a climate summit by the Biden administration. I want to ask you, what do you expect from this summit when it comes to sustainability and climate? And here again, what role can businesses involved in the transatlantic space can play? We see of course, a lot of companies announcing roadmaps to carbon neutrality and wanting to play their role. So I want to ask you a little bit about this and maybe start with Luisa.
Well, I think I already mentioned that we are expecting more of a alignment between the EU and US on this aspect, which is very important. Again, here in this aspect, as you mentioned, we are expecting also to bring other partners in, and definitely China. China keeps saying that it is committed also to climate neutrality by mid-century, and they are also doing a lot of efforts in this area. So I think we can't do it without them, but we also can't do it with other countries like India, for instance. So it would be important that we have a strong alliance in this area, and also the area of biodiversity, which I also think is becoming more and more of an issue, where we also see a lot of push from the public opinion to try to use other tools, including trade. And we're having a lot of discussions right now in Europe around the EU-Mercosur agreement, precisely to try to use trade more to fulfill the climate goals and the climate ambition. So I think here it's going to be one of the issues that we are definitely going to be discussing with the US, not always agreeing. We all know that we have a coming up proposal from the EU on introducing a carbon border adjustment measure. In this case, we see a potential for possible disagreement with the US, and that's why we also, from the start, say that we need to explain well the mechanism to our trading partners, particularly the US, that now is also keen to do more on climate change. So I think we need to fine-tune a bit what could be a common agenda. Overall, we agree on the objective. Overall, we seem to be tuned to achieve more ambition. Where we don't seem to agree for the moment yet is on how we're going to do it, which should be the tools to do it. I mean, and in this case, I'm not saying that we always are also 100% aligned with what the EU Commission is proposing. Sometimes we don't. We also have questions on the how, but I think this is definitely one area where we need a lot of dialogue with the US to prevent more trade irritants, because the risk is there, as we have in other areas, as we have on taxation. I think here we have definitely common message, common objectives, but we are still not fine-tuned on the ways to get there. And this could lead potentially to problems. So it's important that we have a good, open discussion also with the US on how to achieve more climate ambition.
Mm-hmm. So common objectives, but still questions on the how to get there. Susan, I want to ask you the same thing.
No, absolutely. I think one thing, I don't think you mentioned Paris, we mentioned G7, and yeah, absolutely, this is an area for cooperation. But let's firstly begin by saying how much we supported the US decision, like the first thing they did on day one to rejoin the Paris Agreement. So I think that it sets us on the right path with this clear message that of all the issues we have today, climate change has no national borders. So we need a global solution. That's very clear. Think so. Therefore, it's strong cooperation not only at EU-US level, but actually globally, including with China, as mentioned before. So yes, absolutely an opportunity to work together. We as business, technology is key. You know, this. Let me make a point on this. Perhaps is that both the EU and the US need to build on their R&D capabilities. Absolutely, because there's a lot of innovation happening on both sides of the Atlantic. But we need to tap into that more because that can create the solutions. I mean, Louisa mentioned about objectives and ambition and not agreeing on the tools, but we have some of the tools there. We need to ensure that we're giving business the means to invest in these tools more, to find the solutions. And I would actually like to stress here that companies are already doing a lot. So from the business angle, there is a lot being done, researching, developing, a lot of investment in low carbon solutions, including over the last 4 years when this hasn't really been sort of on the, you had a lot of criticism out there. Yes, the companies each have their own roadmaps to carbon footprints. I think one of the problems for government and business is to understand the business realities of how long this all takes. It's time consuming, investment cycles. So therefore, sort of one aspect, this is a little bit more on the EU side. What we need to see is more of an understanding of, you know, not just setting the targets, which are all very, very good, but also providing incentives for business to be able to allow them to develop, give them the time to meet those targets. So it's accelerating also to allow companies to accelerate also the speed of deployment of their top technologies. And I think for this, it comes to regulation. There is perhaps on the EU side, more of a focus on regulation and these targets rather than removing the regulatory hurdles, allowing companies to sort of move ahead in a faster manner because they do have the R&D is available there. Perhaps another point, perhaps more on this side, is the sort of greater understanding of regulation, the impact it might have on one area, but the knock-on effect. If you take PFAS as an example, which don't ask me too much about PFAS, I'm not a chemist, but I do know that maybe that this is the sort of the risk aspect of PFAS. If you're going to ban, before you start banning something and saying industry cannot use a certain range of chemicals, check what the knock-on effect is and then the effect it might have on the economy as a whole. Because we're seeing now the knock-on effect here on semiconductors, and now we have if you ban PFAS, then it impacts the semiconductor industry, and that has even perhaps more serious consequences. So I think there's a lot that both sides can learn. We're looking forward to the Green Tech Alliance. Again, it's another of these dialogues. Again, need to see perhaps some of the details, but definitely there we would really encourage a transatlantic forum to work on common priorities. Such as carbon neutrality, energy efficiency, security, share best practice. It goes back to one of the conversations previously about talking, basically having a dialogue and sharing, rather than sort of unilateral actions and then telling everyone afterwards. It's like, talk about it together and find the solutions together. So a few thoughts, those are a few thoughts on my side.
Marjorie, turning to you, and then I'll pick up a couple of questions.
Sure. I have relatively little to add to what Louisa and Susan have said, only to underscore Susan's point that it's the private sector that will lead the way in addressing issues related to responses to climate change. not just in terms of the R&D, but the innovative technologies that already exist, and the practical reality that the technologies to really get us to net zero don't entirely exist today. And if we really want to get there, we need to make sure that that the incentives to invest and to engage in that R&D to get those innovative solutions out there is going to be essential. And I think also Susan's point about the need to have a sort of for governments for regulators to understand sort of the realities of global business today is extraordinarily important, to make sure that as we strive for these very important objectives, that we do so in a way that reflects sort of common sense. And lastly, I would say, apropos of climate, clearly working with China is going to be critical here. There's no question that the Chinese have indicated that they want to be leaders in this area. We should be encouraging that. We should also not be naive about how much we can expect them to do and how fast. But I do think this is an area where global cooperation led by the US and Europe would be extraordinarily useful.
Mm-hmm. So we have 7-8 minutes left, and I think we've already addressed actually a lot of the questions that are there, but I want to pick a couple, and then basically whoever wants to take the questions can do it. There's the first one on the G7 communique didn't say anything about global taxes or agreement that would have a minimum corporate tax off the table. I mean, first, I think that this is something that the G7 finance ministers had agreed on before the G7. So I think there is already a roadmap on that, but would love to turn to the panelists to see if anyone wants to address the question of minimum corporate tax and maybe how businesses react to it.
Well, I'll just jump in to say to the extent there's been reporting that there was an agreement, in fact, there was, I suppose, agreement in principle, but to what and what shape that, such a tax might take, very much an open question. We, as the chamber, haven't taken a position because, frankly, we don't know what the proposal really is. And until we see the parameters of the proposal, it's really hard to develop a position. I think that the larger question of how do we ensure we have an effective international tax regime to reckon with our digitalized global economy is legitimate questions, and it makes sense for this conversation to be going on at the OECD as opposed to the imposition, as some member states have done, of unilateral, very discriminatory digital services taxes. I think that, to the extent there is discussion also ongoing in Brussels about the prospects of a digital levy, which may be introduced as soon as next month, obviously something that we're watching very closely. Our view is that a collaborative, either if not multilateral, at least plurilateral approach to addressing these issues is what really counts. Until we see more than just the rhetoric around a proposed global minimum tax, it's hard to speak specifically to it.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I can jump in there. Oh, Ben, yeah.
If I could there's also a question that we address. There's also a question Marjorie addressed on digital levy, so you can also pick that one if you want.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in on, I haven't read the digital levy, but I'm happy to do so. I think I saw that earlier. Just to say, indeed, I think, maybe just relating the tax issue to the G7 as well. We're watching it. I think what we can say from this side of the Atlantic, very similar to Marjorie, is that we welcome that there's progress has been made. So that's a really positive sign, because we've been calling for years for an agreement at OECD level. So progress has been made, but we have to remember this is only the G7. Now we need to see whether or not this proposal can get through at G20, and more. We need everyone to sign up to this. So I think the principle also perhaps of a minimum global tax is a good one. Ben, if we take it back, if I may, to the citizen piece as well, if we go back to what the US government is saying about workers, we're looking about citizens. there is a narrative out there that we've got to be very aware of in all of this. So the EU is, not EU summit is my point on the bubble as well. We're in the bubble here in Brussels, the bubble in Washington, whatever bubble you like. Out of those bubbles, I think the governments are very concerned about perceptions. So the tax piece is really very important. But I think the other element on the digital levy, of course, is that, again, not being a tax expert, but the EU there is a perception again of big tech, not necessarily American big tech, but big tech needed to be taxed more and it needing to be more fair. Now you can form different opinions on that. There's the digital levy that indeed should not be unilateral. We absolutely want to avoid this being a country by country digital tax. However, there's also the element of the EU putting the digital levy in as part of its own resources funding with regard to economic recovery. So there's a sort of commitment there that to needing those funds to come in somehow. I think the concern from our side would also be a little bit of confusion. How is this all going to interplay? We've still got the pillar 1 that hasn't been announced yet. We've got sort of pillar 2, the minimum global tax. We've also got the and the digital one and the digital levy. So it's still a little bit of uncertainty there, if we're honest.
A little bit of uncertainty. Louisa, I'll turn to you for the last word, and then I'll take it back to Thibault.
Thanks. I think the taxation issue is very important. Well, first is important because it's a question of public perception, and I think the public perception around the world, and especially here in Europe, is that some big companies, and they are not only tech, well, many are tech, but not only tech, have become very powerful and very rich. And actually the data coming out of the pandemic shows that these companies are even bigger and more powerful. So something that also the G7 said in its states and communique is that you need to change what happened in the 2009 crisis. You need to try to, with a new plan of recovery and rebuilding the economy, to do so in a more equal way and avoid increasing inequality. So I think this is important also for a legitimacy, a political legitimacy for our leaders. Now, coming back to the proposals, I mean, we are also assessing with our members the minimum global tax. What we can say is that our position always has been, as European business, that this needs to be, we need to find a multilateral, plurilateral solution at OECD level. In the meantime, and we see that the progress is there, we see that the situation is going in the right direction. What we do say is that in the meantime, we should avoid any unilateral measures from any side that could prevent an agreement at OECD level. I think this is the more important thing. If we want really to be consistent and have a system that is equal and does not provoke market fragmentation, we should go for a multilateral, plurilateral solution. And I hope that this is something that comes out jointly also from the US summit.
Thank you. I'll just say a word to conclude and turn it to Thibault. Just want to thank all three of you for this wide-ranging conversation. We at the Atlantic Council are committed to the transatlantic relationship in all of its dimensions, foreign policy and security, economic, cultural, and it's always, I think, really important to hear from businesses who are daily vibrant actors of this relationship. We'll, I think, see more in the next few days with the NATO and, of course, the US-EU summit. I look forward to another conversation where we can debrief and look more at the common agenda ahead. And back to you, Thibault.
Thanks so much, Ben, for moderating this conversation. Thanks, Susan, Marjorie, Louisa. First EU-US summit in 7 years. I think it was a great moment to bring together three great representatives of the transatlantic business community. I mean, we've talked about excitement, relief, a lot of traffic in Brussels. I mean, I think my own takeaway from this conversation certainly is there is a sense of opportunity, great opportunity for the transatlantic relationship. We've talked about climate, digital, reform of the WTO, strengthening supply chains, cooperation on China. So So yeah, we're now going to be looking with a lot of excitement at EU and US leaders meeting tomorrow, and hopefully rising to the moment. So with that, just to say thank you on behalf of AmCham EU, Business Europe, and the US Chamber, to Ben, to our free speakers, and yeah, hope to connect with everyone very, very soon. Have a great day.
Thank you.